Hi everybody and welcome to this lesson in section 3.5 of Higher Biology, which looks at symbiosis. So what we're going to do today is we're going to define the term symbiosis, and we're going to look at symbiotic relationships and either categorise them as mutualistic or parasitic. We're then going to take a deeper look at parasitic relationships, and we're going to explain the three different ways that parasites can be spread, and then look at different parasite life cycles, particularly those that involve both a primary and a secondary host. So by the end of the lesson, I want you to be able to identify symbiotic relationships as either mutualistic or parasitic, and also identify what the three different methods of transmission are by parasites, and explain the use of a primary and a secondary host within a parasitic relationship. So symbiosis, very straightforward, is a co-evolved intimate relationship between members of two different species. And there's lots of different types of symbiotic relationships, but we're going to look at two different types. And the two different types that we're going to look at are parasitism and mutualism. Mutualism then is a symbiotic relationship where both the organisms benefit. It's often shown by a ++ symbol. And a good example of a mutualistic relationship is that between a clownfish and an anemone. So within the mutualistic relationship, the clownfish benefits because it's provided with a home. The venomous tentacles of the anemone will provide the clownfish with protection from predators, and also the clownfish will benefit because it can eat the leftovers of the anemone's meal. In reverse of that, the sea anemone is benefiting because the clownfish, because it's nice and bright and colourful, will actually help attract prey that it can, then kill and consume. The clownfish also cleans the anemone and it will remove dead tentacles, so keeping it nice and healthy. Also, the territorial clownfish will help drive away tentacle-eating fish. So it's a really beneficial relationship for these two creatures to be in. Parasitism is the other type of symbiotic relationship, and in this particular relationship, one of the organisms, the parasite, benefits because it gets energy and nutrients, and the other organism within the relationship, the host, is harmed by the loss of these resources. And this is shown by a +- symbol. And a good example of parasitism is head lice in humans. So the head lice will benefit because it gets a nice food source and some shelter, whereas the human is going to be negatively impacted because it could possibly contract diseases from the head lice. So just to give you some other examples of symbiotic relationships. So here we have the acacia plant with an ant gall. Now what is happening is the ant is laying eggs on the acacia tree, and the acacia is covering those eggs with brown flesh, which is what's known as a gall. Now here you can probably already guess that this is an example of a parasitic relationship. Here the ants are benefiting because they have a place to lay their eggs and rear their young, whereas the acacia tree is harmed because it's having to use its energy and resources to create the gall on the infected area, and it's not using those resources for its own benefit. Another example is a moray eel with a cleaner fish. Now here, the moray eel gets a nice clean in the mouth by the cleaner fish, and the cleaner fish is getting a nice meal. So this is an example of a mutualistic relationship. The moray eel is having all of any sort of like dead matter removed from it, and the cleaner fish is having a nice tasty meal. Now, the next thing we're going to take a look at is how parasites are transmitted, and there are three main ways that parasites can be transmitted. One of the ways is through direct contact. So this is when the host and the parasite have to be touching for them to be transmitted. So a really good example is head lice. Another way of transmitting a parasite is through the release of a resistant stage. Now, the resistant stage is able to survive adverse environmental conditions for really long periods until they come into contact with a new host. So, for example, something like the liver fluke will form a dormant stage in water, but it's active when the water is drunk. Another example might be a resistant larvae and pupae in a cat flea that becomes active when it's in the cat host. So lots of resistant stages to things like cysts. Another way of transmitting parasites is through a secondary host or a vector, and a really classic example of this is the Plasmodium parasite that causes malaria. Malaria is transmitted via the mosquito, so the mosquito is the vector, and it just basically means that that organism is carrying the parasite to its host. So the mosquito carries the Plasmodium parasite, and then when it uses its proboscis to pierce the skin and get into the bloodstream of the human, that Plasmodium parasite can then be transmitted into the host, which is the human, and that's where they'll complete their life cycle and cause disease. Now, the last thing we're going to take a look at is parasitic life cycles, and these can be split into two categories, and that can be either like direct life cycles or indirect life cycles. Direct life cycles are probably the most straightforward. What happens in a direct life cycle is eggs are shed and then they'll pass on to a new host species, and the life cycle only involves one host. So again, a really good example of this is head lice. So within head lice, the eggs are shed and then through direct contact they will be passed on to another primary host and so on and so forth. A little bit more complicated is an indirect life cycle, and in this life cycle the parasite actually has two hosts. So the primary host is the site for a sexual stage of the reproduction. Another stage of the life cycle is completed in a secondary host, and for example, some parasites will actually possibly use the secondary host as a site for asexual reproduction, and that's where it will like increase in number, and so that obviously benefits the parasite when it eventually gets into its primary host, because it'll be more numerous. A primary host will become infected when it consumes a secondary host. And I'm going to use the tapeworm as an example of a parasite that has an indirect life cycle. So within the tapeworm, the human is the primary host, whereas a pig is a secondary host. And to add complication to this, the tapeworm actually produces a resistant stage within the pig. Now, a human, a new primary host, will become infected when it is invaded or it consumes the infected secondary host. So if we eat pig meat that has been inadequately cooked, that has the resistant tapeworm cysts in it, we can then contract the tapeworm, and it can finish its life cycle off in us, and it will cause us a whole load of issues. Now, the reason why it seems quite complicated, the reason why a tapeworm like this might have a secondary host is it's beneficial because it increases its chances of the offspring being transmitted to the primary host, which is the human. And this is just a diagram showing you that indirect life cycle of the tapeworm. So we have the tapeworm eggs, and they have somehow got into vegetation that has been consumed by the pig. Within the pig, which is the secondary host, those eggs will hatch into larvae, and the larvae will then infect the pig's muscle tissue. The larvae will then form their resistant stage, which is a cyst, which will exist within the meat of the pig. If you then eat that pig meat that has been undercooked and those cysts survive, because they will be destroyed by high temperatures, which is why it's really important to cook your food properly. If you eat undercooked pork, then you will then take those cysts into your body, and once in your body, those cysts will develop into the adult tapeworm, which will attach itself to your small intestine and draw resources from you. So this is an example of an indirect life cycle. So what we've been looking at today then is symbiosis, and symbiosis is a relationship between two organisms, and that can be split into either mutualistic relationships or parasitic relationships. And then we took a deeper look at parasitic relationships in terms of how parasites are transmitted, and then the use of primary and secondary hosts in a parasite life cycle. What I've put together for you in the Google Classroom is some activities for you to identify relationships as either mutualistic or parasitic, and some questions related to how parasites are transmitted and the life cycle of parasites. So good luck with those, and remember, if you've got any questions, please don't hesitate to contact us.